Anyone who has pushed themselves to the absolute limit knows the feeling. In the final steps of a marathon, or the last repetition of a heavy lift, the sensation is total physiological failure. Your legs turn to lead, your lungs burn, and it feels as though your muscles are completely drained of energy. For nearly a century, the accepted biological explanation reinforced this feeling. The narrative was that working muscles literally deplete their primary energy currency, adenosine triphosphate or ATP, and drown in toxic byproducts like lactic acid. The engine simply runs out of fuel and breaks down. But modern metabolic tracking reveals a biological paradox. When a human collapses from what feels like absolute physical failure, the skeletal muscles themselves still possess massive energetic reserves. This chart shows the ATP concentration in human skeletal muscle during intense, exhaustive exercise. The energy level drops rapidly from 100%, but it abruptly stops. Biochemical analyses of so-called exhausted muscle demonstrate that ATP concentrations rarely, if ever, drop below 60% of their resting values. The profound exhaustion that forces an athlete to the ground is not a localized mechanical breakdown of the muscular tissue. It is an elaborate neurobiological illusion engineered by the brain to keep the organism alive. The idea that muscles fail because they run out of oxygen and poison themselves with lactic acid traces back to Nobel laureate Archibald V. Hill. In 1923, Hill proposed the catastrophe model of fatigue, arguing that exercise intensity is strictly limited by the peripheral muscle tissue breaking down. Hill based these assumptions on tests performed on resected frog muscles that were electrically stimulated in isolated environments. The researchers noted high acid levels and mistook correlation for causation. Advanced tracking has since proven that lactate is not a fatigue-inducing toxin. It is a highly efficient fuel source and a critical metabolic buffer that actually absorbs hydrogen ions to preserve muscle pH and delay fatigue. Furthermore, if a living muscle actually depleted its ATP stores down to zero, the cellular proteins could no longer function properly. Without ATP to facilitate the release of contractile proteins, the myosin heads would permanently lock onto the actin filaments inside the muscle fiber. This locked state is mechanically identical to rigor mortis. If the catastrophe model were accurate, if muscles operated independently until they literally ran out of energy, exhausted athletes wouldn't just feel tired, they would freeze mid-stride in a state of irreversible muscle rigor. Because living humans do not enter rigor during voluntary exercise, the body clearly possesses a preemptive failsafe. In the late 1990s, South African sports scientist Dr. Tim Noakes proposed a new framework to explain this mechanism, known as the central governor model. The central governor model asserts that the subconscious brain actively restricts the neural drive sent to the muscular system. By throttling the electrical signals traveling from the motor cortex to the spinal cord, the brain forces you to stop exercising long before the body reaches a state of true biological peril. During what feels like an absolute maximum physical effort, you might assume you are recruiting all of your available muscle fibers. But dynamic MRI techniques reveal that the central nervous system only activates approximately 71% of the available motor units. Even pushing with every ounce of willpower, the brain ensures a massive percentage of contractile capacity remains in a dormant, inaccessible reserve. We can observe this central restriction in real time. When researchers track cyclists performing exhaustive sprints using surface electromyography, they measure a concurrent decline in mechanical power output and the brain's electrical signals. If fatigue were a mechanical failure, the brain would continuously increase neural drive to compensate. Instead, approaching a critical threshold, the central nervous system actively pulls back its commands. What an individual experiences as a maximum physical effort is a strictly enforced software limit. The brain calculates the stress and restricts motor unit recruitment to guarantee the structural integrity of the biological hardware is maintained. To function as this central governor, the brain relies on a highly sophisticated sensory network. Deep within the cerebral folds, the insular cortex constantly receives and integrates real-time data regarding the body's internal state, monitoring core temperature, blood oxygenation, and muscle tension. As these physiological parameters approach dangerous thresholds, the insula detects a threat to vital organs. It projects distress signals that are translated by the conscious brain into the overwhelming emotion of fatigue. The burning sensation and heavy limbs are generated to manipulate your behavior and force you to slow down. The most compelling evidence that fatigue is a negotiated emotion rather than a physical breakdown is the end spurt. In almost all endurance events, athletes experience a progressive decline in speed and a rising perception of severe exhaustion. Yet, as they approach the final kilometers, runners reliably execute a dramatic acceleration, sprinting toward the finish line. If the catastrophe model were correct, if the muscles were truly poisoned by acid and devoid of ATP at the end of a grueling race, an end spurt would be physically impossible. The runner would be forced to slow down even further as the metabolic crisis deepened. The central governor model resolves this paradox through telo-anticipation. When the brain recognizes that the endpoint is imminent, it recalculates the risk of homeostatic failure. Realizing the body will survive, the governor relaxes its vigil and unlocks the dormant reserve of motor units, allowing a final surge of neural drive. The end spurt proves unequivocally that the body possessed a vast functional and energetic reserve the entire time. The muscles never failed. The subconscious brain simply refused to grant the conscious mind access to them until survival was guaranteed. Elite athletes can use cognitive control to slightly stretch the boundaries of this central governor, tolerating higher levels of physiological disturbance. But a complete, absolute bypass of the biological safe mode only occurs in moments of life or death peril. This phenomenon is known as hysterical strength. Anecdotal and historical reports feature scenarios such as a parent lifting a heavy automobile off a trapped child, a feat of extreme physical output that forces the involuntary removal of all central motor unit restrictions. During an acute crisis, the brain's amygdala detects an imminent threat to survival and initiates a massive neurochemical override. It triggers stress-induced analgesia to suppress peripheral pain receptors and floods the bloodstream with an extreme surge of catecholamines, specifically adrenaline. With the pain switch turned off and inhibitory feedback loops silenced, the central governor is temporarily dismantled. For a brief period, the motor cortex is permitted to recruit nearly 100% of the available motor units, unleashing the human body's absolute maximum contractile potential. But this unchecked power has devastating consequences. Because the uninhibited muscles generate force exceeding the structural capacity of the connective tissues, individuals who experience hysterical strength routinely suffer from snapped tendons and divulsed bones, where the muscle literally tears pieces of the skeleton away. The rapid breakdown of skeletal muscle tissue can even leak intracellular proteins into the bloodstream, leading to acute kidney failure. The catastrophic physical trauma that follows hysterical strength provides concrete proof of the central governor's necessity. Human muscles are built with such immense contractile potential that they will literally tear the skeleton apart if left unregulated. The burning sensation of lungs and heavy limbs is not the sound of a biological engine breaking down. It is the sound of an intelligent safety system working perfectly. The brain prioritizes long-term survival over short-term physical performance. It weaves a complex, painful illusion of exhaustion strictly to protect the organism from its own destructive potential. To explore more investigations into the hidden limits and mechanics of human capability, make sure to subscribe and click on the screen to watch the next video.